Okay, well, good evening, everybody. This is Patrick from the Poison Pen Bookstore, and we're here with another of our virtual events this evening. And today we have a 2-for-1 Julia special. We have Julia Dahl is going to be discussing her brand new book, The Missing Hours, and we have some autographed copies, which is very cool. And so I'll put a link in the comments field if you'd like to purchase one. And our good friend Julia Spencer Fleming is here. I have most recent book in paperback here anyway. And Julia is going to be interviewing Julia. And Barbara's, as always, tuned in from her home office there. And I'll go into the darkness where I belong in just a moment. But if you have questions for either Julia, go ahead and put them in the comments field. And I will be happy to ask any questions you might have. Is when I'm summoned towards the end of the hour. So,
thank you, Patrick.
Over to you, Barbara.
Good evening, ladies. Absolutely lovely to see you. And I'm going to start by saying a few words about Julia Spencer Fleming, our hostess, because I'm afraid I'm going to forget this whole string of awards that she has won. She's the author of a wonderful series that starts, I don't call them religious mysteries, but nevertheless, there is certainly a theme there because Claire is in fact ordained and Russ, the police chief, is not. And their romance is at best unlikely, but has persevered through, I don't remember quite how many books at this point. Julia has been the winner with her wonderful series of the Agatha, Anthony, McCavity, Dillis, Barry, Nero Wolfe, and Gumshoe Awards, Lord, and an Edgar and Romantic Times Award finalist. I mean, that's a really impressive set of credentials and very well deserved. From In the Bleak Men winner to here, I have read Julia in real time and absolutely adore her books and am anxious to read a new one, assuming that she's writing one, which perhaps she will tell us. So Julia Dahl is the author of 3 books about, I'm going to have to shuffle things here, guys. Rebecca, no, do I have it right? Rebecca or is it Rachel?
Rebecca Roberts. Thank
you, Rebecca Roberts. And our timing here is great because there is in the first book, Invisible City, we go into the Hasidic community in Metro New York. I guess it's actually, is it in Brooklyn?
It is, mostly Brooklyn, yeah.
Right, where in truth, we haven't been in any enormous steps since Faye Kellerman wrote The Ritual Bath, which is like an iconic book. And I still remember reading it, how fascinated I was with it. And anyway, after 2 more books, Julia has departed from that series, at least for this book, and written The Missing Hours, which is a very powerful book. It has had a huge number of authors and reviewers endorse it. And it comes from, I'm just going to read this little thing and then I'll shut up. I got the idea for The Missing Hours, she writes, in 2012 when I was a national crime and justice reporter for CBS News. A story had just broken out of Steubenville, Ohio, about a group of teenagers sharing photos of a classmate who had been sexually assaulted while drunk at a house party. Now we know that this has happened at other universities. I think there was a huge lawsuit at Duke, if I have it right. And interestingly enough, Catherine Coulter, who's a best-selling author, and we've done events with her. In fact, we just discussed her book, Vortex. Vortex has a similar scene in it, although it goes in a completely different direction. It's always interesting to me how authors can take the same sort of event or the same general idea and then create completely different stories with them. And I often wonder how these things seem to like get in the air like zeitgeist, and all of a sudden you'll get 2 or 3 books about the same topic, just like from nowhere. And yet, and I want to reassure all you readers, this is true, it takes so long to write a book that there's no plagiarism or borrowing here going on because it's just not even possible. However, having said that, did you read it in the New York Times or whatever it was, book review about the guy that's the professional plagiarizer? He's German, and his entire thing now is to out plagiarists.
Oh,
I'm serious. I mean, I just thought
that's wonderful.
Fascinating.
Yeah, good.
He's an academic that outed somebody's thesis. And like And now he's gone after a politician and proved that like 100 pages of her book she was writing towards election on are all plagiarized. And he's become a professional plagiarist detector.
I love it.
That almost, I'm serious, that almost calls for a book about him.
It does. I could see somebody getting murderous
killed,
over
right?
getting found out, right?
Yeah, but I mean, it could be an interesting series, probably a limited series, but nonetheless, I love the idea.
I'm jotting this idea down right now, Barbara.
And he's had some death threats, and the whole bit. I can't remember if it was. I think it was more likely to be a New York Times story than a Wall Street Journal story. Everything tells me it sounds more like the New York Times. Yeah. But anyway, I thought it was completely fascinating. So having said that, I'm going to turn this over to Julia Spencer Fleming and sit back and listen to what these two Julias. This is great, a 2-for-1 Julia night. Who knew?
I think we should just outline our own plagiarist detective mystery right here and show people how it works, because I do find that an intriguing idea.
A Julia plagiarizes a Julia, and then
a Julia would never plagiarize.
No, I right, of course. So maybe a Julie plagiarizes a Julie.
Well, and as a wrinkle, do you remember all of the effort they went to out whoever it was in Washington? I can't remember the name of the book. That wrote a book, pseudonymously, and they
anonymous. The anonymous one about
the
what now was it about the former guy?
But what I remember is they use software, which was far more primitive than the plagiarist detector guy is using incredibly sophisticated software. But they went through and finally outed whoever it was that had written whatever this best-selling book was as anonymous. So it's scary to think that artificial intelligence is actually, maybe going to be more powerful than real authors.
I hope so. I'm really counting on being in one of the few professions that cannot get replaced by a robot worker. At least not in my lifetime, I hope.
Yeah, right.
So no plagiarism going on here, other than maybe our names, but that just shows our parents were very tasteful.
And very good. Were you named? I was named for the Beatles song, Julia.
I have a grandmother, my father's mother's name, it's Southern, they're from Alabama, it was Jewel. And so I'm Julia as a nod to that. But I have, of course, heard the Beatles song.
Yes.
Many
times, I'm sure.
I had a boyfriend, and we'll leave it right there at that one. So I want to talk about the missing hours first, and then sort of loop back and talk a little bit about sort of you and your writing and what you've been doing up here. So first of all, I have to say, I was going to say this before we started, so it sounded super sincere, but I really loved this. I mean, I loved it, but it was hard to read. I find that, Barbara, you mentioned the idea that suddenly these books are coming that are dealing with issues about women's bodily autonomy and what women have to go through and what women are willing to do about it. And I suspect that there's been a significant cultural shift with the onset of the Me Too movement, where all of a sudden, we're realizing that things that used to be just okay or that you brushed off are not okay. And they were never okay. We just kind of let them go. Right. And I have to say, as the daughter of a college student, this is like my worst fear, It's one thing I was thinking. So for our viewers here who want to know, I mean, you pick up the book and you'll see what it is. But our one of our protagonists, Claudia, sorry, Claire's mine, is an NYU college student who at the very beginning, she wakes up, she's been blackout drunk, and she wakes up and she pretty obviously has been assaulted. She doesn't acknowledge that fact for some time. She's sort of shoving it out of her mind. She's embarrassed. She's ticked off, and she doesn't remember anything at all about it. This is one of the things that I was thinking about, because of course she's young, she's a college student,
Yeah.
is that in our society, like young men at college age are allowed to be carefree.
Mm-hmm.
But for a girl, a young woman, it's being careless. And there's this kind of feeling with Claudia and with other people that, how could you be so stupid? How could you do something so, so dumb? Talk about that a little bit, because it's shivery. It's a shivery thought.
Yeah, I mean, it is a hard, and I wanted it to be a hard book to read. I think of it as like, I wanted it to be a short, like punch you in the face, brutal book, which I guess it sort of is, for better or for worse. But, I was inspired in some ways by one of the big books of the last 20 years, The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, in that, Claudia, the protagonist of this book, is very different. But sort of what a trauma like that and a shock to your system can do to you. But then for this book especially, I really wanted to look into not only what it does to you, but what it does to your family and kind of everyone around you, that this like violence happens to you and there are these ripples and you just have no idea where they're going to lead. But yeah, I like Barbara read, I remember, and this was almost 10 years ago, reporting on a story out of Ohio of a high school girl who got too drunk at a party and some boys assaulted her, and they took pictures of it and video. And it was, and I reported on that story for over a year, and it was so chilling, right? I mean, I couldn't stop thinking about this girl and like what it would be like to know that like you have no memory of what happened, but all these people around you have pictures of it, and you at your most vulnerable, you're humiliated, and that you would never know, like around town when you met somebody, if they had seen you like that, like what that would do to a young person. I mean, a kid, right? Like, and then also what that would do to her friends, what that would do to her family, how that would change their lives. So I wanted to write about that. And then over the next few years, I wrote a lot of stories when I was at CBS about, as Barbara said, about sexual assault at universities. There was a movement it was in the latter sort of half of near the second Obama administration, around 2012, 13, where all of a sudden universities, women at universities would be assaulted, which they often, have for a long time. And they would go to the university and sort of say, like, I need help. I need, this guy is living down the hall from me, or I have to see him every day in class. What can I do? But they were reluctant in some ways to go to the police because, again, they, when you're in college, college is supposed to be sort of like function as your parent a little bit, like your home. And so you want to feel like you can go to somebody and they'll help you. But colleges really had they were not in any way prepared to deal with this, right? Like maybe there was a counselor who could help, but actually figuring out what to do when someone has accused someone else of a crime and they live on the same dorm, and it's already one of the most difficult crimes to investigate and prosecute in the world, but then having colleges involved in it, where it's not like there's a campus police that's going to do much. And so all these students were starting to really get angry at their universities and say, you guys need to set up some policies, some, sort of situations where we can come to you, we can make ourselves known, we can go through some kind of process with whoever, our perpetrator is. And I ended up interviewing a couple young women who were suing University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And they were, and they have now gone on to just do really amazing things, going in to get PhDs and law degrees and work on this. But and it's funny, I actually started writing this book. I always knew I wanted to write Claudia's story, sort of the story of a girl wakes up and she knows and she's been assaulted. What happens next, right? But I initially thought of it, because I'd been writing the Rebecca Roberts series, I originally thought of it as, well, maybe this is a story that Rebecca would investigate. But when I started writing it several years ago, it quickly became clear to me that I was much more interested in Claudia's story and her family than I was in sort of having Rebecca be involved in that. So fortunately, my publisher and agent are incredibly understanding, and they usually say to me when I have like some wacky idea, they say, if it works, you can do it. You know, so that's what I did, and I'm really glad I did, because I love obviously my previous books, and I think someday I will write more Rebecca books, but I was ready to explore other people, I think, and other parts of society and other worlds and other voices too. This book has there are 3 voices that are the main voices in the book, and then there are a couple other point of views near the end, but I really wanted to jump around and just get in different people's heads.
Yeah. Well, I think there's some stories that absolutely fit within the framework of a series, and then there's some stories that need to break out and do something different, in part because when you've got compelling characters, Claudia is a really, really powerful character, and not, but also I should say not like instantly likable. There are things throughout the book where you're like, you know, and part of it is her youth. And part of it is, one of the things that I thought was really interesting with this is also that you are writing about the power dynamics between men and women. And we get to see this in a couple of different places. We see her super kind of dysfunctional parental dynamics. Her sister got unexpectedly pregnant and has just had a baby with, they're married, right? Yeah.
They're married, but they haven't known each other that long.
Yeah. Like
accidental pregnancy. Yeah.
Insta husband.
Yeah.
And
exactly.
then we've got another young man who shows up early in the book, who is a nice guy, but honestly, you know, I'm reading along and you're thinking, is he a nice guy or is he a nice guy?
Right.
Which is, you know, is a very interesting question. But along with this male and female dichotomy, you are also looking at what turn out to be sort of the really corrosive effects of wealth and inequality. We've got one character in particular who does not have much money. He's at a very expensive school in the most expensive city in America. And then other people for whom money is just something they don't have to think about, and other people for whom money is a pointed weapon.
Exactly. And I really wanted to, so, you know, to the point of Claudia's sort of likability, you know, one of the things that I really wanted to do in this book was create a victim survivor. She goes, you know, she's sort of in both, who was not somebody that you and I might sort of say, like, you know, she's wealthy, she's beautiful, she's, you know, kind of uses her sexuality, you know, she's kind of like one of those girls you would see on Instagram who's constantly posing in a bikini, or, you know, because she's 19 and she's beautiful, and why not? You know, okay, why not? If you, you know, if that's your thing, do it, right? So, I mean, I have no problem with that. But then what happens when that girl, who was used in some ways, sort of flaunted her sexuality, or at least been kind of out about it, decide, like, if she gets assaulted, she knows immediately that everybody's going to be like, you know, what did she think was going to happen? You know, she got too drunk and she was wearing that skirt. And I wanted the reader, I wanted it to be a little bit hard for the reader to sort of feel sorry for her, because she, you know, again, she's wealthy, she's beautiful, she's a little bit careless, and I because I think that even, you know, because I wanted to challenge people to think about the idea that even someone you don't like deserves justice when they've been the victim of a crime, right? And I thought a lot about that because, and how, you know, who she was and how to make her character sort of be that kind of person you don't like that much. Because one of the things you learn when you're in the news business is that there's this sort of ugly dichotomy of the clean victim and the dirty victim, right? So, you know, you don't see a lot of documentary specials about, you know, a drug addict who's sexually assaulted and murdered, or a homeless woman who's sexually assaulted and murdered, right. Or, you know, but the white, you know, the pretty blonde suburban mom is the clean victim, and she's right. Easy to like and easy to feel sorry for. And although Claudia is, you know, white and privileged, she is, she is, you know, sort of unlikable in that she has flaunted her sexuality, and frankly, she, you know, that kind of privilege is a double-edged sword for her, right? It's like, you know, if Kim Kardashian decides, you know, if Kim Kardashian has been sexually assaulted, or Megan Fox, somebody who kind of is out there with their sexuality, there are going to be a lot of people who are just like, you know, and I really wanted to challenge that, because I think everybody deserves justice.
I love that, because you're right. We all know the sort of the good victim, the innocent, you know, white girl with blonde hair and blue eyes, and you know what she is. I found as I was reading, what got me was I didn't feel sorry for her, which might have happened if she was. I mean, she's a little bit obnoxious in that way that self, you know, that she's 19 years old. I've got my youngest daughter's 21. Like, I've been through this period with 2 girls and a boy. It's kind of obnoxious, but what you do, instead of feeling like, oh, you start to get angry along with her as she gets angry, which is a more compelling story. And, you know, certainly for me as a reader, it pulled me forward into it. And then, of course, it makes it it adds this element of uncertainty, because someone who is strictly feeling victimized and that you feel sorry for, you can kind of expect they are going to react in certain ways. Someone who is enraged, you don't know what they're going to do. And you don't know what Claudia is going to do.
Right. Yeah. That unpredictability, that sort of like, something happens and you don't know. I sort of think of it as like the sexual assault is like a bomb that goes off in her life, and you have no, like, the shrapnel is just going to go everywhere. You don't know where, and you don't know which direction. And I don't think, you know, and she doesn't know, you know, she's sort of like in shock and stumbling in the dark. And, you know, most people are not going to do what she does. And I don't recommend necessarily that people do what she does. Right. But I wanted to tell the story of, you know, it was, I started this book. I actually started this book pre-Me Too. Like, I started this book, and I want to say like early 2016, before Trump was elected, before Me Too. And at first I almost put it down, because I thought, well, is this a story everybody's going to feel like they've read? You know, and then, you know, of course, years go by, and you realize, like, this story is never getting old. Like, this story is always you have a different, and maybe a different nuance, and that kind of thing. But yeah, I wanted it to be, that anger, I think, was important. And just the poisonousness of anger, and of the idea of revenge, like that, you know, does it really make anybody feel better? You know, does it really, and if it, and then does it set the scales in balance? It does it for some people, does it not for others? Like, I mean, I think a lot of what I wanted to do in the book is just raise sort of questions. It's not like a real, you know, sort of tied in the knot.
I mean, there is a lot. And there's also the question of collateral damage. Like, who are the people along for the ride who wind up getting hurt in various ways.
Right. And that's one of the things you don't like about Claudia, because she kind of forgets that other people are getting hurt in her name, you know, and, you know, do I blame her? Do I not blame her? It's not really I don't really have I don't feel like that's my place to judge, but she does, you know, she, like you said, I have a 19-year-old. I mean, the sort of self-centeredness of that, and the way that trauma and shock, and then, you know, anxiety and depression can make you very, frankly, self-centered, because it's very hard to get out of yourself. Right. So what that does, that like myopic vision of the world. Yeah.
I'm turning my mute button on and off as
for the dog.
Don't worry about the dog.
I should say for our listeners, I'm in a 3-dog household, and you know how it goes. One dog hears a thump. God forbid the neighbor next door, you know, closes their car door or something, and then they all get very excited. So you mentioned about starting this in 2016, and I actually wanted to ask you, in part because I got lots of questions along this when I had a book out in 2013, and then my next book out in 2020. So I want to make sure I get the name right. Conviction is the third of your Rebecca Roberts books. Mm-hmm. And that came out in 2017.
Right.
And so you've got a gap. And I kind of think I maybe know what the explanation is, but as the mother of three, but I'd love to hear what. Yeah.
Yeah.
So tell us about that.
I blame my son entirely. Right. So so I published my first book in 2014, then the next in 2015, then 2017, and now has it been 5 years? 4 years. Feels like longer.
Yeah.
So basically I had a baby in 2015, at the end of 2015. And I had, being a writer and also a journalist, I was, my life was sort of in thirds. I had like a third of my brain was the reporting world, a third of my brain was being a novelist, and a third of my brain was like my life, keeping my relationships and blah, blah, blah. And then you add a kid to that and figuring out how to rearrange my brain from that was really tough. And it took me a long time to figure out how I was going to write, how I was going to have time, not just to write, but the really crucial part of writing, which is the thinking part, right? The just sort of wandering around the world with the characters in your head and the plot in your head and who's going where and what's going to happen. And that I felt like that just dropped out of I couldn't do that for a while. And I struggled. I struggled and I sort of felt really bad about it. And I felt like, I'm so, and it was tough, but I was still like, I knew I cared about this book. I knew I would finish this book. It just took a lot longer. I'm very hopeful that my son just started kindergarten the week before last, and which is crazy. I drop him off and then I don't see him for like 6 hours.
Isn't that weird?
It's insane. It feels like cheating, like, because when you're a parent of a young child, especially, and I've been lucky enough that I've been able to mostly work from home, so I've been taking care of him, and my sister-in-law also takes care of him a couple days a week, but that I get to be, I'm still a good mom, but I don't see him 6 hours a day. It's something.
That boy, that first day of school is like,
oh my God. And he's loving it. And which couldn't make me I'm so happy about it. So I'm very hopeful, I've recently started another book, and, I'm very hopeful that it better not take me 4 years. I'm thinking, 2.
It is possible. I always threw my kids under the bus, and it really wasn't them, I mean, when you've got a really young one. So I have a theory that is breast milk is comprised of brain cells, because I'm pretty sure they were leaving my body. So you do feel really super foggy. I wrote my first book and then had my third child, and then and then was sort of juggling that. And my older two were 6 and 7 when she was born, so they were off in school, and it's hard. It is hard. There was a reason I always bonded with the few writers that I knew who were kind of active duty mothers. When I started writing, most of the women that I knew, women writers, either had never had children, or they were where I am now, which is, their kids are young adults or college. And so that just frees you up in an entirely different way. One of my good friends is the wonderful Los Angeles author, Denise Hamilton. And, she and I would bond over that. We had little kids together. And it's tough because motherhood and writing are on completely opposite ends of the spectrum. Because motherhood is all about being super present, open, attentive, and writing is all about closing away the rest of the world, creating this space for yourself and your imagination and your work, and telling everybody else to go away.
Right. You can't really do that with a 3-year-old. You
can't just tell that to them. Like, even if you shut the door, they bang on the door.
And like, I didn't want to, and for a while there, I felt like, well, I wasn't doing either well. I hated myself for not writing, and I hated myself for being, sort of distracted mom, because I was hating myself for not writing, right? But I think, at least in the last couple of years, I've sort of realized, first of all, like, I hope lots of people buy my book, and I'm really excited about it. I'm really, I feel like this is a different one for me, and I'm excited to see how it does out in the world. But it's not like people are hanging out like desperately waiting for another Julia Dahl novel. Like if it takes another year and I can, be a present mom for my kid, that's worth it, And when I finally kind of internalized that and was like, this is a finite period of time that I have with the small child who's at home with me, and it's okay if it's another 6 months, like it will be fine.
Yeah, Julia, I had 7 years between 2 novels. So
oh, wow.
Believe
okay.
me, anybody who is less than that is going to look good at Minotaur. Minotaur,
yeah, right, right.
Our
I know, but
publisher,
and my editor, Kelly Ragland, is amazing, and she's a mom, and she was like, writing is part of life, and life is complicated, and you do what you got to do, and thank God for that, because this book was 2 years late. This book was supposed to be out in 2019.
Don't worry. I'm gonna make you look good. So
okay, thank you. All right, 7 years. That's intense. Yeah.
Yeah. That
but
was a
look
long
at you
trip.
now.
I know. And you know what? Readers were very happy. It's you when you're a good writer and you write stories that people want to read, they'll show up again. And
I feel that way. Yeah.
Writers have
lives.
To
wait for my writer's book, I'll wait.
Yeah, exactly. I think that is absolutely what they're doing. All right, let me check that out. Okay, good. We're not doing too badly, time-wise. So you are now balancing motherhood and writing.
Mm-hmm.
What are you thinking about next? Because this really is a very different. So I've read 2 of your Rebecca Roberts novels. Everybody was like, when The Invisible City came out, it was like, hey, this is a book and it's a woman, it's got religion in it. So
they said that to me. They were like, you have to read Julia Spencer Fleming because she writes about the Episcopalians, you write about the Jews.
I think, they're Christians, they're Jews, they're religious. I think we may have even been on a panel in BoucherCon.
Like a BoucherCon many years ago.
Yeah. I always get the panels about religion. They never give me the panels about sex, So, never the good ones. But this really does feel different in a lot of ways. And I was going to ask what you're doing next, but actually I want to circle back and say, do you feel like you are expanding your stride as an author? Because I know that with the Rebecca Roberts novels, you used, as so many of us do, you used a lot of your own life. So many writers, that's where you start. You start with, you write what you know, and what you know is your own life. She's a reporter for a sleazy tabloid. You were a reporter for a sleazy tabloid.
Her mother's Jewish, her father's Christian, my mother's Jewish. But yeah.
Right. But this is clearly a break from that.
Right.
Do you find that liberating? Do you think that you are going to be striking out in new directions?
I do find it liberating. I think more than anything, I just find it more interesting. I feel like especially Invisible City had a lot of sort of stuff I was working out, my ideas about religion and mental illness and journalism. And now and I was in a different place in my life. I was writing that book I think I started writing that book when I was 30, and I'm now 44. So at 30, I wasn't yet married. I obviously I wasn't a mom yet. I was still kind of really finding myself. I feel like my 30s for me were a time when I learned finally to trust myself and to feel like maybe I do know what's best for me. So I was kind of working that out. And now I'm just a lot more interested in other people's lives than my own. Like I have a happily boring life, right? Like I'm lucky in that I have, a stable life. I have a husband that I adore. I have a beautiful, healthy son. I have friends. I have work, which is wonderful in terms that I go to bed feeling good at night, but it's not that interesting. Like nobody's writing a thriller about my life, right? So I, now my curiosity is really, my focus is just on other stories, and everything all for my books, and I mean probably for a lot of us, it comes from a truth. It's not my truth, but it's like, I know someone who this happened to, or I know someone who was like this, and there are pieces of people I know in most of my characters. I have sort of, it's a mix of these two, this character is a mix of these two people, or this character is like this, and then it goes off for that. And that'll be, my next book is going to be set in, I moved out of New York City a couple of years ago, about 40 miles north. I live in the Hudson Valley in a small kind of like river town. And I love it here. And it's also a really interesting place. So I'm going to write about a small town. And I'm going to write about a reporter again. I'm going to write about a small town reporter, although not a woman, a young man who works for kind of a dying and badly run small town newspaper. Because I still am, and always probably will be, really interested in newspapers and media. And even when Invisible City came out, the media was so different. Even that's only been 7 years. It's just so different. I mean, small town papers are all but dead, and and the consolidation of media is so dramatic now. And I really still want to write about, and I really am interested in reporters, people who choose to tell stories for a living. They tend to be, and I think, interesting people, curious people, often kind of screwed up, and those are interesting people to write about. So I'm gonna the next book I'm writing is going to be more of it's going to be another, this will be again, the Missing Hours is not a murder mystery, right? Like, it's not, my other books, it's like the first chapter you have a body, and at the end you figure out who did it, and the Missing Hours is very different. But this, I think, will be, it's still going to be, it's not going to be a sort of a straight line mystery, I don't think, but it's going to be a, body in the first few pages, and figure out who and why and how and all that as we move through.
I feel like there's certainly still a market for straight line mysteries, but it feels to me, certainly from what people, my readers tell me, and the books that I really respond to, is people read mysteries for the character, and the setting and the jobs that the people are doing. And the mystery it's just the engine in the car that keeps it moving forward. So we finally get someplace.
Yeah, exactly.
If you could, I mean, I know when I'm writing, the actual mystery portion is the very last thing I ever come up with. I've got the characters, I've got what they're doing, I've got, the situation in my town. And then at some point I'm like, okay, somebody's got to get killed. who's going to get whacked, and how and why?
Right.
And then eventually it's like, I guess they have to figure out who did it.
Right. So you don't plot that? You're not a plotter now. Yeah.
I'm not.
Yeah.
I'm not.
I'm not either.
I'm actually, with the book that I'm working on now, I am using a sort of an easy outline system that I have a good friend who lives in New Hampshire and Maine, Jess Esteveo, who also writes as Jessica Ellicott. And she does this very simple, you do it with Post-it notes, and basically you just split the book up into acts, like most of us do naturally. And then just, so that you're going to have a turning point, and then you're going to have the the crisis, and then you're going to have the reveal. And so kind of picking those points and writing out what I know what's going to happen, like one act at a time.
Yeah.
And that I can actually do. And I'm liking that, because it's kind of keeping me moving forward a little bit better than I often do.
Yes.
But I still have room to surprise myself.
Yes. And that's what I'm hoping to do for this one. I've got like a very rough kind of, what is the question that gets asked at the end of the first act? What is the question at the end? What, how does this, because with the Missing Hours, it really was a struggle, because I kept, first of all, I kept changing the end. I can't tell you how many times I've changed the last 50 pages, or not even, 30 pages. Because and I changed a lot of sort of what is revealed and when by which characters, and it just took forever. I can't tell, like, so this book it's a short book. It's only about 65,000 words. And I have more than 70,000 words in my got rid of file. So I wrote so much of a book that is not the book anymore. I think I had to do it.
Missing hours, the director's cut.
The director's cut. It would be very bad and go in all kinds of crazy directions. Exactly. But I would like to avoid that next time. I feel like if I had done a little more work up front, a little more thinking and deciding about just where I want to go, I think that would save me a year or two, which would be nice. I think I was just listening to the New York Times Book Review podcast, which I listen to a lot. I trying to manifest myself onto it. If I listen to it enough, they'll invite me on. But they were talking about Sally Rooney's new book. And, I'm actually a big Sally Rooney fan. I loved her second book in Normal People because I thought that I thought she had like a Jane Austen level understanding of the human heart, of the way that like men and women react to each other and sort of go past each other. But the guy who had written her the review was talking about how she starts a book not necessarily with plot or characters, but with relationships. And that's actually how this new book that I'm writing definitely started. I've been thinking about a sort of mother who had a son very young, and now the son is in his 20s and he has a young child, and the triangle between her, him, and his wife. And that relationship sort of circle is what's really going to drive this book. And then figuring out kind of who each of those people are has been like the second step, but starting with those relationships, because relationships really are what drive, in a way, action, right? And and I feel like, to your question about sort of how we change as we write different books, I like to think I'm getting better at it, if only that I'm making it a little easier for myself, that I feel like, each time I do it, I'm like, all right, well, I won't make that mistake again. I remember very, very specifically writing my second book, Run You Down, and I gave the first draft to my agent, and she told me something that I use always now, but I had never occurred to me then. And she was like, look, you can't have your reader knowing stuff a long time before the character does, because then your reader's just going to be like, well, when are they going to find out what I already know? They're going to be impatient.
Yeah.
And that makes perfect sense. As a reader, when I see that in a book, I'm annoyed. But as a writer, I hadn't thought of that. So that was like a big lesson to learn. And I feel like with this book, The Missing Hours, the lesson for me was that I needed to better understand the relationships between the people in order to have sort of a stronger scaffolding to build on.
I do wonder if sort of, preparing that scaffold, though, would actually have worked, because I felt that I feel that The Missing Hours is, if you weren't already established as a mystery author, and it is a thriller, it's thrilling, you're like, oh my God, what's going to happen next? But right. I felt like if you had just come and you were, Julia somebody else, that it might have been marketed as a literary book, because it feels, it is both pulse-binding, but it also has a literary feel, and that at the heart of it is this exploration of character and how and relationship, and how characters react, and how relationships move under the stress, and what happens. Except if you did that, you would not have this boss
right
cover. They'd probably give you something like really, I don't know.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, one of those literary books with a boring cover.
Right, like a clock.
Yeah.
Which could be cool, I suppose, if you did it right. I mean, that's really that's lovely of you to say. Yeah, I mean, I think I really wanted to read a book that was fast. I appreciate a fast-paced book. I appreciate a short book these days. And I wanted that, but exactly, it's not that kind of traditional, not even a traditional mystery. It's not even, but it is, I did want it to be sort of thriller-ish. I wanted it to be dark and fast-paced. And I was going to say something else to what you said, and now I don't remember, but perhaps I will remember it soon enough.
Right. I'm going to stick in a couple of comments. One of which is that a mystery does actually not have to have a murder in it in order to be a mystery. There are all kinds of crimes. And I think that oftentimes we've gotten into a rut thinking there always has to be a dead body, but it could be a missing necklace or a stolen painting or a kidnapped child. I mean, a lot of things. And the other thing is the thriller definitely doesn't need to have a murder in it.
Right.
A thriller is entirely different, but crime fiction, which is what I call it, is a very broad umbrella. And, you don't have to adopt the traditional way in order to tell a story, which I think is good. The other question before we call Patrick up that I wanted to ask you, you've talked about the difference that that your character here, what's her name? Not Claire, but
Claudia.
Right, is careless. And, a big question I had was, why would she get blackout drunk in a situation where there wasn't really anyone to look after her? So I don't think that it was her wealth or her beauty or her sexual, whatever it is. But if there's any blame attached to her, it would certainly be because, she let herself or drank herself into this state. Now, you need her to be that way in order for her not to remember what happened. I understand that. But I do think alcohol is a really volatile thing, and especially for kids.
Yes.
The big scandal when I was in college was not about a girl. It was about a boy who got blind drunk and either sat or lay down in the Sigma Nu driveway, and some unfortunate other person ran over him.
Oh my God.
And then the question was, it was a horrible, it was just as traumatic for, I think it was a boy, for the boy that ran over and killed, the drunk in the driveway, as it would have been, I know it's not a personal violation in the way of rape, and I don't want to equate them, but it's still an enormously traumatic event.
Exactly.
In which alcohol was the culprit.
Exactly. And that is, and I mean, I totally, exactly. And that is, it's funny. I've been trying to write an essay about this, and I think I've decided that I'm just going to let the book be the essay, like that what I wanted to say about alcohol and sexuality in college and is in the book. But so many times, I mean, one of the things that I've thought a lot about as I've been doing this reporting about sexual assault, not just on campus, but throughout, very often it does happen when one or both of the people involved are intoxicated, right? Especially, young freshmen in college. I think that of all the years in college, you're most likely to be sexually assaulted your freshman year because you leave your home, you leave the nest, you're in this place that's totally new. You have no one is at home enforcing rules on you, right? Like if you can get alcohol, you can drink alcohol, but you don't really know how your body reacts to alcohol, and women's bodies react very differently to alcohol than men. And I have had so many times, and I did in college, my freshman year in college, I got so drunk that I went on a date with he ended up being my boyfriend, and he was a great guy, but I went out with him. And I got so drunk that he had to carry me home, and I was throwing up, and he put me in bed and left. But, what if he hadn't? Yeah. What would it have been my fault? Would anybody have believed me if I said I didn't want to have sex with him? I was too drunk.
Well,
you brought him home.
Yeah, but that's where the whole question of consent, comes in. I'm sorry. I mean, I haven't, read law for 40 some years, but the question of consent is central to rape. And, and if you're drunk, if you're blind drunk, it's very difficult to ascertain whether there was consent. Was the drinking, in fact, in the company with this person, was getting that drunk in its way a form of consent.
Right.
I think from a legal standpoint, not a moral standpoint, it's a really difficult question.
It's really difficult, and it's basically impossible to prosecute those kinds of cases, right? Like if I am so drunk you know, I mean, my signature wouldn't count on a document if I was that drunk, right? But I could consent. But could I then consent if I were that drunk? Does getting that drunk make me, you know, I mean, there's not, it's really thorny issue. And that's kind of why I wanted to write about, because again, I feel like that happened to me a half a dozen at least times where I was so drunk that I just got lucky that the person I was with, or you know, my friends didn't leave me, and the guy I was with didn't take advantage of me. But if I had been with a different guy, it could have been a totally different thing. And so, you know, is the punishment, like if I get too drunk, do I deserve to get raped? You know, like what do I deserve? What happens to me? It's just a really, it's a really tough question.
Is if the guy is really drunk, I mean, not too drunk to perform, but too
How
drunk
does he,
to,
exactly.
you know, I mean, you know, I was lucky that I can't drink. I mean, everybody who knows me knows that. So I have never actually been blind drunk because I just can't tolerate alcohol. But I do think where I've had more than I should have, never to the blind drunk point, most of the stupid things I did, you know, could be attributed to drinking because it takes the brakes off.
Totally.
And,
yeah.
you know, I think that men can get into trouble just as much as women can, being
Definitely.
drunk and do stupid stuff.
I also think it's interesting, and this is not a question that's addressed in the book. It's really a cultural question. So I'm looking at us, and we're kind of three different generations of college women. Julia, I'm assuming you were like late 90s.
90s, yeah.
I was in the early 80s. You know,
And
Barbara, you were
19. Well, I graduated in 62, so a long time back.
So, okay. So, yeah, in all of this, in 62 and 83 and, you know, 97,
yeah,
alcohol is a problem on campus. And these issues are the same generation after generation. And it's still an issue on my daughter's campus. Yeah. She's going to be class of 22. And it's still an issue on her campus.
And there's, you know, there's kind of a fraternity house drunk culture. I mean, you know,
totally.
And that's not just in the United States. I mean, you can read lots of British, you know, stuff about, you know, in fact, there's a drinking culture in England that's a lot stronger in general and in Scandinavia than there is here in the United States. But, you know, fraternity, one answer to this on campus has been to ban some fraternities at all, or, you know, because that culture can coerce men sort of into doing, you know, the culture itself.
Exactly. You know, I mean, you know, right. You know, I mean, the bottom line is that for the most part, men are, at least in these situations, you know, sort of more physically stronger, and they, you know, if they want their way, they can get their way. But it's true. I mean, you know, I like, you know, I know a lot of men who have been very drunk, and I don't know any of them, as far as I know, who have turned into rapists, but you can definitely make very bad decisions that you wouldn't make when you were sober, when you're drunk. And it's exactly,
or if you're being egged on by a group, because I think the really awful cases, and that's a whole different thing. Rape, I think it's the gang rape cases that have always just horrified me. You know, I mean, and there are terrible instances of it. And, you know, you can read novels about war, you can read all kinds of situations. So, you know, it's a tough subject, and I think you did a wonderful job tackling it and writing about it. Patrick, why don't we sum you up before we get to
I was just talking to some of my friends in town here. I'm having like a little sort of book signing party at a local bookstore, and I'm newish to town, so a lot of people don't know I'm a writer, and if they do, they haven't read my books, and I have to warn them, because they see me on the playground with my son, right? And I'm like, just so you know, these books are really dark. Like, so, you know, it's like, I think,
and they're not like, autobiographical.
They're not. Exactly. They're going to be like,
Right. So, Patrick, any questions, or is everybody stunned?
Everybody's pretty stunned for the most part, but and actually, you've discussed some of this stuff. But Mia asks, she says, Julia, what impact do you hope The Missing Hours has on readers? And what are you most proud of with this book?
Oh my gosh, that's such a good question. I think the impact, I hope that readers question themselves and their biases about women who are survivors of sexual assault. and, you know, sort of who is a good victim and who's a not good victim, you know, who deserves it and who doesn't deserve it, who deserves justice. You know, I think everyone does. But also I want them to examine their biases a little bit about men and women. You know, we didn't talk a lot about Trevor, who's sort of the nice guy in this book, but he's also quite complicated, and the way that he is in many ways very confused and conflicted about how he feels about Claudia, because he does clearly see that she has been the victim of trauma and he wants to help her, but he's also kind of hopelessly attracted to her in a way that he kind of feels like he can't control, but he doesn't, and he feels uncomfortable about it, but it also just is, and him trying to figure out, like, how do I deal with that sort of the way men and women think about and talk about and are expected to think about and talk about sex is something that I hope readers at least think about. I mean, I don't feel like this book has a lot of answers, but I hope that it forces people to ask questions. What am I most proud of? There's actually, my favorite chapter in this book is actually the chapter, I want to do it without a giveaway, but it's one of the chapters of one of the men in the book. I'll just say it's the Jeremy chapter. Jeremy is one of the guys. And that is, again, without too many spoilers, I really loved writing, and I'm going to do this again, and I want to do it more, writing from the male point of view. I'm married to a man and I have a son. So I spend most of my time with men. And but my previous books have been almost mostly from the point of view of women. And I feel proud about the way I wrote about some of these men. I'll be interested, you know, I mean, it's funny, like with, you know, I don't know. I mean, I know a lot of men who have read this book and will read this book, but in the larger society, I don't, you know, there's sort of tends to be a little bit of a trouble with men picking up women's books. A lot of men are like, that's a girl's book. You know, there's a lady on the front and I don't want that. I'm hopeful that more men will read this book and will feel like I captured the nuances and difficulties of young malehood now well, but it's definitely going to be something that I'm going to be writing about in my next book too. One of my main characters will be a man as well, a young man.
Cool. Julia Spencer Fleming, have you mentioned what you're working on now? There are a couple of questions about that.
Yes, I am working on the 10th book in the Claire Ferguson, Russ Van Alstyne series. The title is At Midnight Comes the Cry, which is taken as the other ones from a hymn, and it's my version of a Christmas book, except you know it involves death and explosions and a white supremacist militia cell. And nice. Holly and Ivy and, you know, jingle bells.
Unicorns.
Yeah.
Let's see here. Okay, Vanessa asks, to both Julias, what authors have most influenced your writing?
A good one.
Well, I'll answer that first while you think about that one. I feel, especially at the beginning when I was sort of shaping myself, I was very influenced by an author who is not as well enough known outside of New England as he should be, Archer Mayer. You know, he does this.
I collect him.
I know, terrific author. He's one of the best mystery authors that, you know, you are not reading. And he does this, his sense of location is so acute, and the state of Vermont is the third or fourth character in the book, which is what I wanted to emulate when I was writing mine. You feel like after reading one of his books that you can go driving through any part of Vermont and you could navigate just by the fact that you've gone there with Joe Gunther, who is his lead detective. I also find myself kind of chasing after, and I deeply admire Kent Kruger, William Kent Kruger, who writes about family and writes about faith and writes about people in these really complicated relationships in a small town. And I love his books, and I love him too, because he is just the sweetest, nicest man ever. So
he writes about Minnesota primarily. So in the same way that Joe Gunther is a voice for Vermont, Tony Hillerman, the Navajo Reservation, and Michael McGarity wrote about New Mexico. And I love books where that the landscape is indeed.
And I do too. I'm always very, very drawn to books where the location makes a big difference. Frankly, I think that's one of the great strengths of crime fiction. A lot of what I think of as like Atlantic monthly fiction is, and I love the Atlantic, I have a subscription, but it's like this nebulous suburbia. And crime fiction is often super, super specific to the locations. You can't imagine taking a story out and moving it someplace else.
I think about Margaret Barron and the Bootlegger's Daughter. I mean, we spent all that time in North Carolina with Margaret, and it was sensational to do that. In fact, the other Julia's books, taking us into the, going into the Hasidic community in Brooklyn was a really powerful thing. In addition to the characters, the nature of the community, the rituals, the whole bit were fascinating.
I read mysteries always growing up, Agatha Christie and Stephen King and Christopher Pike and John Grisham. And that was my thing growing up. But then when I went to college and I sort of switched over to quote unquote literary fiction and, read a lot of great books and stuff, but it wasn't until, and I actually wrote a novel and a half in my 20s that, I couldn't get representation for. It was not very good. And it wasn't until 2006 when I was living down in Georgia and I went to a Barnes & Noble and I saw Gillian Flynn's Sharp Objects on the table. And it was that great cover with a razor blade right on the front. And I had worked with Gillian at Entertainment Weekly years before. And I remember thinking, well, that looks good. So I picked it up and I read it, a night. And I was like, that's the kind of book I want to write. I remember thinking, if Gillian can do it, I can do it too. But it hadn't occurred to me until then that I should write the books I like to read, which are the dark books, the crime fiction books. Somehow I thought, well, I need to write, I need to be A.M. Holmes, or I need to be, I don't know, so a literary novelist who I love, but that wasn't what I was reading as much of. So Gillian Flynn was very formative for me in terms of making writing as my career. And Tana French was starting her series right around then. And I read those women and thought, like, that's the club I want to belong to. Megan Abbott too, reading that stuff in the early mid 2000s. Right now, one of the authors that I like the most is I guess she's sort of categorized as literary fiction, but really they're crime fiction books, which is Celeste Ng, who wrote Everything I Never Told You and Little Fires Everywhere. And they're both, Everything I Never Told You is, the first line is like, she's dead, but they don't know it yet. And Little Fires Everywhere, the first scene is that somebody has set a big giant house on fire, and the question is why and how. And I love her work because it's very much about family. It's very much about sort of the weight of family, sort of drama often over generations, and the weight of regret and so I think of the book that I'm writing now as being like a mix of Everything I Never Told You and Mare of Easttown. I don't know if you guys watched Mare of Easttown on HBO, but I loved it.
That was great.
Oh yeah, right. So it's like got that grit, but then the family drama of Everything I Never Told You. But speaking of places, writers who I read a lot who write about place, Laura McHugh is another a current writer who writes about the Ozarks, and most of her books revolve around women in circumstances that they sort of are stuck in and are trying to get out of. And she is a truly beautiful writer, but I feel like I've never been to the Ozarks. I feel like I've been to the Ozarks after having read all her books. And I love that about her. I love that each time she has a new book, we get like a different part of that world. And who is it? I say Sean Cosby, who just won, who's sort of gone so big in just the last few months or year or so. I think he won the Edgar this last year. And He writes about sort of rural Virginia, and same thing. I mean, like you feel like you've been there, and it's true. It's like just soaked in that place. And I hope that my next book that the Missing Hours isn't as much a place book. I mean, it's very much a New York City book in that you can kind of get all around really quick. But The Invisible City was, I felt like, really a book about New York City, and I hope that my next book maybe has a little more of that place in it.
Laura McHugh just happens to be watching, and
Laura.
Hey, Laura.
Yeah, hopefully we're going to do a little book chat too if she agrees to do it.
Also a very cool person.
Yeah.
And
Have you guys read this author William Boyle?
No.
Fantastic.
Oh.
Yeah. I'm just reading this Shoot the Moonlight Out. But everything you're describing, I think his sensibilities would appeal to you, I think.
Well, Barbara, you were talking about books being like in the air. One of my favorite authors and one of the people I like the most is a woman named Amy Gentry, whose most recent book, Bad Habits, is so great. It's so like, I mean, it's a murder, it's a crime fiction, but it's also really juicy. It's just like, it's got some good sex, and it's a really fun book. But her second book came out in 2019, and it's about it's sort of got a sexual assault and revenge element to it. And I went to her book launch, and I remember I bought the book and got it signed, but I very specifically did not read it because I knew, I'm writing a book about the same thing, and I didn't want to. I kind of was worried, what if she does it better? Or I don't want to be influenced by what she does. And I just picked it up like 2 weeks ago because I'm like, all right, I'm done with this. Now I can read it, and it's also great. She's also very good.
Wonderful.
Are we, if we're doing recommendations, can I make one? Because I've been reading something. This is coming out in winter 22. So this is, it doesn't even have a cover left. Hager Road.
I like that title.
Yeah, exactly. By Samantha Jane Allen. This is a debut and won the Tony Hillerman Prize novel. Wow. And I'm reading it for a blurb. It's a Minotaur book. And it is just, she has such an amazing voice. It's set in kind of the Badlands of Texas. I mean, I don't know Texas very well, but it's one of those books where it's like you kind of feel like you have to wipe the dust off of your face. And she conjures up this area that is left behind economically, and the families that are still there, and the young woman who's at the protagonist of it, who is generations deep there, and everybody thinks she needs to leave and go to law school. She's come back after college, and it has this just this terrific sense of place, and also how place pulls people in.
Yeah,
the places that you can't leave.
Is it the Llano Estacado, Julia, that region? Mm-hmm. Is it the Llano Estacado region in Texas?
It may be. It's they say where it is, and I'm
the Comanche country.
Yeah. All right. I'm going to pull one up that I just picked up. It was sent to me by Ted Flanagan called Every Hidden Thing. And for once, Patrick, I might actually be ahead of you. You'll be interested to know this debut is recommended by James Elroy and Wiley Cash. And Wiley Cash is instrumental. And I'll tell you why I like this book. Aside from Worcester, Massachusetts, which is a, kind of Rust Belt New England town in big trouble. But this guy who was an EMT, he has a character in here who is every guy that stormed the Capitol. And he has made this character so amazing and so real. I've never been inside the mind of a person like that. I can't even conceive, in fact, of a person like that. But this guy has done this extraordinary job. He's not at all.
That's like the highest praise you can get. That's art, right? Like make us get inside the head of somebody.
No kidding. I mean, he's not the main character, but there's several characters involved, but he's really Patrick, we're going to meet tomorrow or Thursday or whatever. I'm going to finish this and bring it into you, but I'm thinking it's going to be our first mystery discovery for October. And of all publishers, it comes from Crooked Lane, whose whole thing, is cozies. So every once in a while, they sneak in a book that it proves that you cannot make assumptions I got a big box of books from them because nobody's really doing ARCs anymore. And as I plunge out, you know, Strawberries at Halloween, or, you know, the various cozy titles, here's this book, you know, and I thought, whoa. Anyway, I'm riveted by this character. And I think, you know, spending a little time, you have to be in Worcester first, as we've been talking about, to really understand why anybody would be like this, to be in that kind of Rust Belt, you know, decaying community. But then to see how that has shaped this guy's mind is truly amazing. That's so awesome. Again, it comes down to character and place, right? And I mean, the plot's kind of incidental. It's probably a good plot, but I'm not paying that much attention to the plot. And
so
that's one of the things we really,
assumptions, you know?
Yeah, exactly.
Crime fiction is not always plot driven. I mean, it can be, and that can be the reason that you love it.
That's good. Yeah.
Anyway, we probably said enough, and it's 14 minutes after the hour. So thank you.
Just talk forever.
Everybody, you know, we always start and everybody thinks,
intermission. Everybody go and get another drink, and then we'll do another hour.
Yeah, I mean, it's such an anxiety sometimes. Do we really have enough to say to fill an hour?
Right.
Never fear.
Always
works out. Anyway, thank you all for joining us. Thank you very much, Julia and Julia. It's really been a great pleasure.
Thank you for having us. Thank you, Julia.
Patrick, thank you for your time. Let me wish everybody a good evening and remind you that we do have autographed copies of The Missing Hours.
Yes.
We blew through all of our autographed copies of Julia's book when it was in hardcover, but now it's out in paperback.
So let's blow through mine in hardcover.
Yes, yes.
Yes. I'm sure that we
will. Julia Purity.
Right.
Yeah, right.
I'm sure we'll see Julia Spencer Fleming for her next book. And I can now reveal that on December 9th, Julia is one of the 7 Jungle Red writers. We're going to have a Christmas cheer party at 4 o'clock our time, which is 6 o'clock her time. So we'll have a libation and we'll just talk because nobody's actually going to be pushing a book. So it'll be really like this.
By that time,
anyway,
Barbara,
thank you very much, everybody. Bye.
Thank you.
Take care.